that came together, in that person's life by accident. I want to put this in historical perspective for young people like you and others who may actually see this and not know anything about the world in which I grew up. I grew up in a world in which we didn't have a television in the house. Such things as oh, an iPhone or all the modern apps that you use, all of those things weren't even a distant dream. Many of the rural Illinois homes where I was born didn't even have indoor toilets or electricity. So, we're talking about a time in history that was a very turbulent time for the United States of America because I was born in 1939 and the so called Great Depression, in which millions of Americans, black and white and immigrant and whatever, stood in soup lines all over this country because poverty was so widespread. So that depression, was from like around 1921, 22 through 1939, that Great Depression. And in, in the meantime, you had African Americans who were really struggling because we had to struggle not only economically, but we had to struggle against racism. And what a lot of people don't understand is they say, "Well, Mrs. Gibson, you were born and raised in Southern Illinois and Eastern Iowa. I mean, weren't you kind of privileged? I mean, you weren't born in Mount Bio, Mississippi. You weren't born in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, or whatever." But it doesn't matter historically. It doesn't matter whether a black person was born up south or down south. What I'm saying is that historically, you couldn't possibly imagine what life was like for my brothers and sisters and I 75 years ago. Tell you a little bit about my parents. My mom was 33 years old when she got married. She was the secretary at a little church in a little town called Muscatine in Iowa. My mother was born and raised in eastern Iowa in this little town on the Mississippi River called Muscatine. And Muscatine's claim to fame was it had a button factory, the largest button factory uh, in the area at the time, and they had a slogan: "We button the globe." And my mother and as many members of the family as could get work there worked in the button factory. It was on the Mississippi River because many of the buttons were pearlized, and of course, this is where the pearls and so forth came from. Anyway, um, in that area, there were so few African Americans. Our family was basically poor, but we were African American. We lived on the same street with German immigrants. There were so many German immigrants that in order to communicate in the neighborhood, my mama had to speak German. So here's my mama, a black woman in her childhood, speaking German, right, with her neighbors. And one of my cousins there was so proficient in German that people of every color would come to him and say, "Can you translate that for me? Can you tell me what that man is saying?" And so here we have an area in which white immigrants, many of whom were German, many of whom were Irish, right? Um, this is where I grew up, and I'm not where I grew up, where my mother grew up. Okay, but now where does the Irish immigrant come in? Her maiden name was Lamb, Lamb. She married into, well, I mean, her mother married into the C family, spelled Seay. They were a mixed family who claimed to be more African American uh, than anything else, but Irish. Some of their people came over to this country in 1848 with the potato famine. Yeah, yeah, my people on that side, okay, the Lambs and the Seas, they kind of bastardized the name, if you will. It had been O apostrophe Seay. Now, some people called it OC, some people called it Osay, some people called it O'Shea. But somewhere along the line, the O dropped off and it just became Seay. And
Was it a problem with African American and German immigrants being together? And you think that could have been an issue with the name being that, so they had to change it to Americanize it?
could have been, honey. Your guess is as good as mine. That sounds about as logical as anything. But you asked me, how does all of that come to be? Here we get this crazy, mixed up, poverty-stricken family. Um, Mother who can speak German. Um, you know, growing up in a poor community, mostly white people. I mean, maybe she didn't even know that she was black until she married my father and moved to Southern Illinois, and her child dies because racists won't treat her son.
So your mother actually had it better where she was.
Well, yes, because they were poor and unlearned, but baby, everybody was poor and unlearned. The Germans, the immigrants, um, the few black folks there were. Nobody wore shoes. Everybody wore jeans with patches on them and so forth and so on. You know, poor white, poor black, poor Irish, poor German, it didn't matter. My father, who admitted to be at least uh, 15 years her senior, um, I don't know how to put this in a genteel way, but the man reinvented himself all over the country according to whatever doctrine or plan he chose. He was whatever age he wanted to be, when he wanted to be. Nobody ever traced down an exact birth date. So he claims to be at least 15 years my mother's senior. So that means if my mom was born in 1901 and she didn't get married until she was 33 years old. She married a man who was almost 60, and then immediately, these two old folks proceeded to have 6 children over the next 10 years. Now, of that six, sibship of six, I am number five. I am number five. And to tell you a little bit about that environment, um, my mom and dad moved from eastern Iowa to southern Illinois. My father admitted to having a formal sixth grade education. He had been buffeted around, he was self educated for the most part. And my mother had dropped out of high school to help her brothers and sisters when she was 17. Now, if she was born in 1901, we're talking her dropping out of school at the start of World War One. At the start of World War One, right? So she had to help maintain her family. And through her efforts, her youngest brother became a public playwright, a PhD, a college professor. But my mother, the most brilliant person I knew, had only a 10th grade education. So you're talking about me, the woman that you're looking at right now. You're talking about me as, oh, how would I put it? Um, Somebody who was born in a rural country setting 75 years ago to parents, neither of whom had a high school education, right? And you ask yourself, what are the what are the chances of such a person growing up to be a college graduate several times over with one academic award after another, credentials in writing and teaching and whatever, and four of those six children being college graduates also, some of whom more than one time over. I mean, what are the chances of that? If I could describe myself in terms of my life's work, I'd have to say that my career choice has been that of an educator. I've been a combination educator, teacher for more than 33 years of my life. But my other choice prior to that was to be an activist and writer, someone with a social conscience who disturbed the status quo in America. Sometimes I think that a career, a person doesn't really choose a career, but that career or that life path chooses the person. And now, later, in my life, after I've made these career choices and things, I look at what I've done and I say, okay, I'm a Christian and I believe that God has a purpose, a plan for every human being in the world. Now, some of us get a chance to recognize that plan, and we live in families and communities that nurture that, and others of us don't. Some of them, like me for a while, kind of stumble around in the darkness and then accidentally stumble upon the career choice or the life activity that you choose. That's how I became a social activist. And being a social activist led me to being a teacher as soon as I could free myself up to do that. Well, I taught bonehead English um, at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills, in the early 80s. Um, I should not say bonehead English. That's a pejorative term. As you know, when students come in to the Cal State system, they take an EPT, an English placement test. And if they score 150 or lower, that means the student must take a remedial English course before that student can be admitted to an English 1 class. It just so happened that I was in the right time at the right place, or the right place at the right time. I was finishing up my graduate studies, master's degree in English, and working on teaching credential at the time. And I worked in the EOP office. That's the the office that helps people who are educationally disadvantaged to catch up. At any rate, the person who had been designated to teach that summer course couldn't do it at the last minute, and I was selected to do it. So I was paid as the professor for that English 009 classes, is what we called it at the time. So that was the extent of my college teaching. But from there, after I earned my credential, teaching credential, I taught at Dominguez High School for 7 or 8 years. And that's in Compton, on the border between Compton and Paramount, California. So you got kind of a racial, ethnic mixture of about, maybe at the time, 70% African American and maybe 30% Hispanic, but of varying backgrounds. There were a few African Americans who came from fairly affluent homes in which there were books and so forth and so on. But most of my students were very much in need, academically and whatever. And for all those years, whether it was in the Compton Unified School District or the Los Angeles Unified School District, whether it was teaching African American children or whether it was teaching Hispanic children, I have always taught the disadvantaged. And I have done my best to make them stellar students. And I have so many of them over the years that I am so proud of. Black and brown kids who just made it. I graduated cum laude with honors from Southwest College in 1979. I was able to transfer the few credits that I had from Northern Illinois State Teachers College and Aurora College, which was then Aurora University. I transferred those to LA Southwest, and I made straight A's in every single course I took at Southwest. Those grades, averaged with my transfer grades, gave me an AA degree, cum laude, with honors. In 1982, I graduated from Cal State Dominguez Hills, magna cum laude, with high honors. And a year later, I had earned a master's degree in English at a straight 4.0, made the president's list. And when I came for my honors, the president, whose name I won't mention at that time, said, "Oh, I see you brought the whole tribe, because everybody I could bring, I wanted to come and watch me get that degree." There was a president at the time, you can look him up, when I got that master's degree. And when I walked up there to accept those honors, I took the tassel on my cap and threw it out. I said, "Mama, that's for you." Oh, well, when I was at Dominguez High School, not only was I the teacher, but I seemed to be Coach Mama. All the sports teams, black and Hispanic, the soccer teams, the cheerleaders, the football players, the basketball players, for some reason, all wanted to be in Miss G's class. And I was Miss G. So, in at that time, I taught kids who were superior, stellar athletes. Like, I don't think either one of us will ever forget the experience. Cedric Sabalos, who was a graduate of Dominguez High School, used to call me Coach Mama, just like the rest of them. Um, Became a professional basketball player who uh, played for the Phoenix Suns, number 23 small forward, and then later was traded to the Lakers, was number 23 again, small forward, under the Lakers that were owned by, not owned by, but who participated with Magic Johnson. I have had some very, very memorable students. Oh my goodness, over the years, some of their names escape me, but many of these students achieved academically and whatever, and they were interviewed for whatever honors they received, and they talked about the teacher in their lifetime who had impacted their lives more than anyone else. And I believe in the 33 years that I taught or was a literacy coach for LA Unified School District or Compton Unified School District, the many children whose lives I touched. I think I was nominated for um, uh, stellar awards for teaching. Oh, I guess maybe 15 times. And that has to give you kind of a feeling. And then in December of 2003, I wanted to write about this marvelous class that I was teaching at Southgate Junior High School. I was teaching the gifted, two classes of gifted, and three classes of the most remedial students that you can imagine. Eighth graders, some of whom read at second grade or third grade level. And yet I was able to work with them and bring them up to the point that honor students, special students, and all my students that year took top honors in terms of the scores that they achieved. And most of them made the greatest um, leap of literacy. Some grew as much as, I don't know, 5 years in literacy. I focused on reading. I focused on my classroom being the kind of place where everyone respected everyone else, the kind of place where you didn't have to package your words in pretty little tied up bows. You could say something and make a mistake, and nobody was going to laugh at you. You were accepted for your ideas. And that's the kind of group that we grew up in. I had children who had never read a novel in their whole lives finish a year with me that year, having read 7 novels, not just read them, but understood and were able to conceptualize and react to them and apply life lessons from those things. Anyway, it was in December 2003, I entered a contest sponsored by the California Association of Teachers of English. It invited professionals to share the greatest learning experience that was also a teaching experience. And so I wrote this article called Voices, semicolon, an urban educator. looks at life. It won the California Association of Teachers of English prize for that year. It was printed in California English. And from then on, many, many people would call on me and ask me for this or that or the other thing. But um, I thank God for the talents that I was given. I thank my parents, my ancestors, for the genes that I inherited. I can't take credit for intellect. I can't take credit for talents and abilities that were natural, that came to me, over which I had no control any more than I could choose the texture of my hair or the color of my eyes. But I can take credit for what I have chosen to do with those things. I don't have any apologies to make to anybody. I've spent 33, 35 years of my life paying it forward. I want to pay it back because I don't believe that any generation of Black children should go backward. And that goes for Hispanics and poverty stricken. It goes for all of us. All of us have nots. We don't have the choice to do anything but go forward. My life as an educator has been just that. Actually, that was one of those things that I stumbled upon. Um, as a teenager, I worked in the cornfields and so forth and so on. There were many immigrant workers there. And if somebody next to me in the road next to me was speaking Spanish, I picked it up. And then later, as I began to matriculate through school and whatever, I realized that there was a growing population of Spanish speaking people whose needs needed to be addressed, and they weren't so very different from the needs of our people, my people. And so that's when I decided that I would indeed speak Spanish. And I did become a language development specialist certified by the state of California in 1991. So, I mean, I have not only a master's degree in English, but a California state teaching credential and a state designation as a language development specialist. I mean, I know the Lord's Prayer in Spanish, and I attend a Spanish speaking church. Some of the most wonderful people I know, the most generous people I know, are my Spanish speaking brothers and sisters in church and the neighborhood. I can be proud of many of the things that I do and have done in my adult life. I take pride in my choice to have personal integrity. I want to be able to talk to you and to do it honestly and to do it from the heart. That's what I want to do. Be a person with integrity, a person whose word can be depended on. I don't have to say, I swear on my mama I'm telling the truth. I swear for cheese and grits I'm telling the truth. No, I declare. And I want to be able to stand on that word. I like also to take pride in the fact that I have compassion. I choose to have compassion. But for the grace of God, I could be in anybody's shoes. Well, I guess this is one of those nature versus nurture questions. It's the kind of thing like how much of a role does your environment and your surroundings um, play in the person that you become. Well, whoever I am, aside from the genes and whatever that I inherited, things that over which I had no control, I came from an environment that had certain values. Um, my parents didn't have formal education, but they valued education. They wanted their children to learn. Sometimes we were the only family in a rural country town that had a book in the house besides the Bible. We always had a World Book Encyclopedia, and neighbors and whomever would come and ask my folks questions because they could read and write and they owned books. That's why we were never really poor. So I grew up valuing education, but also understanding that I am part of a racially marginalized, isolated group. And that environment, witnessing racial injustices and learning about them from my parents, those things helped me to develop the kind of social conscience that would make me want to be an outspoken advocate of justice for everybody. In addition to that, um, I would have to say that I'm trying to figure out the right words in which to cast this. I think what you're asking me is how and why did I become a social activist? Let me start by saying the people who influenced me, my mom and dad, were products of their environment, okay? My father had always wanted children. My mother was willing to give them to him, that they would have them together. So, over the 10-year period from the time they got married until the time they left Southern Illinois, they had 6 children. I had 2 older brothers whom I never met because one of them died when he was 9 months old, the very year that I was born, 3 months prematurely. The other died when he was 3 years old. And in a story that's passed down through our family from my mother on, that brother of mine, who may have grown up to be the president or whatever, nobody knows, because his life was cut short because of racism. We're talking Southern Illinois in 1937, where race riots were common, but other people didn't know that. My father was a jackleg preacher, an itinerant preacher who was given authority over a small neighborhood church in a southern Illinois town. His oldest son, one of the brothers whom I never had the privilege of growing up with, developed what we now know is asthma, and it led to a cold, which led into pneumonia. But at the time he was suffering an asthma attack, my father allegedly asked the next door neighbor if he would take him and his dying child to the nearest hospital. This is Southern Illinois, uh, in, um, in and around Litchfield, where I was born. My father got to the hospital carrying the child who had almost turned blue in his arms. He was told, "We don't treat colored here." And my father said, "But But look at my boy. He's dying. He just needs somebody to help him breathe. And they said, you'll have to go across the border to East St. Louis. And in the time that it took the neighbor to drive into East St. Louis, where a doctor would treat my brother died in my father's arms. Now, that one event, you say, how could that possibly affect and impact you, Emily Gibson? Well, it affected me this way because this man was my father. This man was responsible for my training and upbringing and so forth. He lost his will to be God's messenger. He lost his will to be the family man with the responsibilities that he should have had because he was so disillusioned and angry that his baby boy should die from a treatable disease. They treat asthma all day long. I haven't. My life has been saved many times. But that's all that would have had to have happened for my father. Anyway, my father became disillusioned, and in his disillusionment, he became a bitter man. He became a bitter man who became abusive and alcoholic and just gave up the church, gave it up. And so we wandered around to several towns in Southern Illinois, finally moving to Chicago in 1941 when my younger sister was born. And from there, we moved to a Chicago suburb, a little place called Aurora, Illinois, where my brother, my surviving brother, and my sister, my two sisters, and I grew up. That's where I went to elementary school. That's where I worked in the fields. That's where I graduated from high school. That's the environment that we're talking about. So those things impacted on me. What I'm thinking that racism denied me the right to know my big brother. Racism denied me the right to know the father who could have been, but became disillusioned because of it. And in the meantime, when you grow up in a situation like that, where there's not only poverty, hey, I mean, if I chose to take the alphabet and find either a noun or an adjective for every negative experience that my brothers and I must have had in growing up, I could probably pretty well fill that. But I didn't want to focus on that. I don't want to focus on the negative. I want to focus on the fact that, yes, we faced poverty and abuse and parental alcoholism and so forth and so on. But baby, we survived. We survived and were resilient enough to overcome. To overcome. I owed it to somebody to pay it back. So, 1963, when a man named Medgar Evers, field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, was unceremoniously assassinated, shot down in the streets. I made up my mind that day, with my husband and three small children, struggling to make it. College dropout, nothing on the ball. But I said to myself, I must play a part. I must play a part in this struggle for justice in this country. And that's where my activism started. And to make a long story short, by the age of 23, I had become the youngest Black woman NAACP president in the state of Illinois. And from there, just activism of all kinds. Went to jail, got this scar on my forehead, hit with the butt end of a rifle when the city was under curfew in Aurora, Illinois. Well, the organization of which I was the young president, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, chaptered in Aurora, Illinois. My board of directors was basically young like me. We didn't have any experience. We didn't have anything. I was 23. I was 23 and had three small children. I was 23 years old with no experience anywhere to do what I was doing, but I had the will to do it and the enthusiasm and the ability to speak and address and make people feel the urgent need to join us in what we were doing. So young people from all over, from neighboring towns of Elgin and Joliet and Maywood and other towns around Aurora, Illinois, came to our aid, and we took to the streets. We took to the streets and we demanded an end to public accommodation segregation in the city of Aurora, Illinois. We're talking 1963. You could go into a bar and cash your check. But a drinking person, a guy couldn't buy a beer in the same bar that cashed his check. We'd go into restaurants in that same city and in the town, the college town where I started at Northern Illinois University, which at that time was Northern Illinois State Teachers College in DeKalb, Illinois. There were signs in restaurants. We reserve the right to seat and serve our customers. And it wasn't until we got in the place that we found out that that meant we don't serve Black folks. There was a place in DeKalb, Illinois, when I went to Northern Illinois Teachers College. It's called McCabe's Tavern. They served green beer and had shamrocks in the window. And as college kids, it was kind of a hangout place, you know, for pizza or after hours studying or whatever. My white schoolmates used to always talk about it. And one day they invited me to go along for a St. Patty's Day party. We get to McCabe's and that sign is on the wall. We reserve the right to seat and serve our customers. They let my classmates in and would not allow me to even come in the room. Okay, when a person experiences things like that, you begin to feel like something's wrong with you when it's really something that's wrong with the society. So when I led those demonstrations and later received an award as an outstanding young woman of America in the year 1967, they credited me with having been the leader of the civil rights demonstrations that opened public accommodations in Kane County, Illinois. Dr. King was so famous. He was everywhere in every newspaper, everything. I never dreamed I would ever meet Dr. King, and I did. But he wouldn't know Emily Gibson from a can of paint. But I marched in so many demonstrations, at least 15 demonstrations all over the country, some of which I took my children to, and they rode my shoulders or rode the shoulders of my friends as we marched in demonstrations that were led by Dr. King. But I did get to know some of his lieutenants. He had a brother named A.D. King who did know my name. And we often sat around and joked and talked and, talked about the kinds of things that I'd never get close enough to Dr. King to ever know or ever do. So it was leading my own demonstrations and having the hundreds of wonderful people who came to our aid and walked with us. Um, we had crosses burned. Um, One night, I guess it was in the wee hours of the morning, my husband and children and I were asleep. We had just made a public announcement that we were going to march on City Hall for an end to housing segregation. That night, someone crept into the yard. They poured gasoline in the form of a cross and lit it. You burned the concept of burning a cross was a sign of racial and ethnic hatred led by the Ku Klux Klan. You ever heard of the KKK? A racial hatred group that hated blacks and Jewish people and anybody who was other than Aryan, white, blonde haired, blue eyed, and whatever. So they burned a cross on my front lawn. And one of my board members was a young man a little older than myself, whose name was Bill Burrell. Bill Burrell had been blessed with physical agility, and he had become a stellar football player at the University of Southern Illinois. He had met and knew Jesse Jackson. They were friends and had played football together in many places. Well, Bill became a board member while I was president of the NAACP. And as the chairman of the board, they burned a cross on the lawn where he and his wife and children lived. Jet magazine came out. Star football player, the target of racist bombing. Jesse Jackson came out and said, I'll help you lead this demonstration. So we made these signs and placards that had fiery crosses on them and things like, we've been double crossed. And we took to the streets and we changed forever the way that politics in a provincial, racist little town like Aurora, Illinois was. When we finally moved to California in 1970, I continued my activism here, but I grew. I grew, and from just defending African American people, my heart reached out to people of all colors and all ethnicities who were deprived, the have-nots of this society. And I ended up talking about women's issues and world peace. And in the early 1970s, as a social activist in this area, I had gained a certain reputation. A lot of people didn't like to have me around because I told it like it was. And I was selected as one of 101 United States delegates in 1973 to attend the World Congress of Peace Forces in Moscow, which was then the USSR. We're talking about how I grew as a social activist who first started with civil rights issues that were germane only to things like desegregation and so forth, um, in and around where I grew up. But when we moved to California in 1970, I had gained so much experience as an activist and as a speaker that I became sought out by organizations and whatever who wanted a motivational speaker. And not only did I go and do motivational speaking, but I was part of every picket line that I could walk that had meaning to me and whatever. As a result, some of the women's groups got together and asked me if I would be one of their delegates in the fall of 1975 to the United Nations Conference on Women in Berlin, Germany. I accepted the challenge. They paid my way. I was a poor little black woman from over here on East 47th Place in the hood, across the water in Berlin, testifying about the needs, the special needs of black women, and why it was so difficult for many of us to just go out and become so-called feminists like Betty Friedan and some of the white women who had a choice to do that. We were more involved in issues about our survival, issues that made us be both black and a woman. And with those priorities, we had to struggle to find our way. At any rate, I became part of that delegation to Berlin, and I am so thankful for the opportunity. The Los Angeles Times allowed me to cover the conference for them. My story, post-conference, appeared under my byline, Emily Fuller Gibson, on the front page of the View section of the Los Angeles Times. What was so shocking was that I was able to meet women activists from places in Africa and places in, um, I don't know, Asia and Asiatic countries, from places all over the world who shared stories that were sometimes so heartbreaking that I looked at my own and thought, there but for the grace of God go I. I shared and listened to these stories and learned from them. One of the most fantastic experiences I had was to um, serve on a committee on which Angela Davis was also a member, and to meet in person Winnie Mandela, who at that time was an outspoken social advocate, the wife of Nelson Mandela, who was at that time rotting away in prison in Robben Island, I was able to sit on committees and rub shoulders with some of these women. Women also whom I totally respected from down south, black women's delegations who came there in the name of Fannie Lou Hamer, and they talked about having had their lives endangered for walking picket lines to enfranchise black people, to give black people the right to vote without intimidation. And I was so proud of these women, so proud to be one more like them. And one of the stories that I'll always remember is that I stayed at a hotel called the Hotel Sophia, somewhere in my memories and whatever. I still have my room pass and so forth and so on. I have my delegate's badge and that kind of thing. But on the day that I was supposed to address a session of the UN Conference on Women in Berlin, I had carefully taken notes on what I wanted to say. And when I was called to the podium, I stood there. There are delegates from 144 different countries, but there were translators, and each ethnicity had its earbuds on, and the translator for that language was translating my speech simultaneously. And it tripped me out because I'm talking and all of a sudden a hand goes up. Sir, the Italian delegation just understood what you said. They're giving you a round of applause. Okay, so I spoke almost to constant applause. I'm not sure if I made my point. I came down from the podium in tears. I don't know. God has been so good to me. I don't even know how poor little black girl from the rural area of southern Illinois, born of parents neither one of whom had a high school education, not only grew up to be someone with multiple degrees in academic and teaching awards and challenges, but someone who was internationally respected, given a chance to go across the waters to places like the USSR, while there was still a USSR. I was part of history. And that United Nations delegation in Berlin, I saw and touched the Berlin Wall. I was part of history, Ray. Those things aren't there anymore. But I was there and can prove I was there. And I just have to say, whoever said it, I don't want to plagiarize. Wherever there's an oppressed person, I am not free. And as long as I am not free, I have a duty, a responsibility, an obligation to reach down, to reach out, and help my brothers and sisters, whatever color, whatever ethnicity, whatever. I owe it to the God who gave me existence.